Welcome to Voices of AIS. My name is Zaira, and today we are interviewing Miss Cathy Ayer, a humanitarian known for her dedication to helping others and her commitment to creating meaningful and positive change. Through her work, she has made a significant impact on communities in need and is widely respected for her thoughtful and responsible approach to humanitarian efforts. This interview is an opportunity to learn from her experiences and gain a deeper understanding of the importance of humanitarian work. This interview is an opportunity to gain a deeper understanding about the vast topic of humanitarian aid. For someone who may not be familiar with humanitarian aid, how would you describe your role and the work that you do?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, it's a concept that's sometimes hard to understand, right? Because there's such a big world, there's so many things going on. But when I talk about humanitarian aid, you really have to think about what do people need? If there's a big crisis in the world, if you have been affected by a war or you've had to leave your home because of a natural disaster, what are the basic things you want someone to help you with? This is the fundamentals of humanitarian aid. It's safe shelter, it's something to eat, somewhere to be with your family, medical care if you need it. It's all the basic humanitarian needs that need to be fulfilled after a disaster or a conflict. Now, this needs to be done in a safe way, and it needs to be done by the people who understand what they're doing. So there is a whole industry. Humanitarian aid is part of a big global sector that you have the United Nations, you have international NGOs, you have local organizations, you have community groups. Everyone's part of this big global effort to provide this basic humanitarian aid when it's needed. So really the role that I do is I work for one of these humanitarian agencies that's trained, that has experience, that has funding, and that has presence in all the countries that's affected by crisis. So what we do is we go into these countries and we try to assess what's needed, what the people need, and then we provide the services and the response that's needed. So essentially it's giving people what they need in a time of crisis.
What does the word humanitarian mean to you personally, beyond its dictionary definition?
So this is another great question. Humanitarian to me means anything that is given purely because someone needs something, that they're a human being, that they fundamentally should be helped because you have an empathy for that person, and also they have a right. So there's something called human rights, and everyone shares the same rights. There is international law that underpins this, and people have a right to safety, to protection, and to services if they lose everything. And there are these things called humanitarian principles that the whole sector have to sign up to. I've signed up to, UN signs up to it, other agencies, and these humanitarian principles co-defines the term humanitarian, that you have to give aid based only on need, not based on politics, not based on race, not based on whether you think that person deserves it, you know? So it's really fundamental that when you give aid, it's not because you're being a nice person or you like that person. It's because humanitarianism is fundamentally enshrined as a principle that you help your fellow man because they're a fellow human being. So it's really underpinned by the principles, and for me that's what also guides me in my work.
How did your upbringing influence your values and eventual decision to work in humanitarian aid?
I'd like to tell you I had some very interesting upbringing, but I didn't. I grew up in the north of England. My dad's a doctor, my mum was a social worker. I had a very ordinary childhood, and I think that shows that anybody can be interested in this kind of work. You don't need to have a big event in your life, but you do need to kind of grow up with an inquiring mind. And I see in Alphabet School that you guys are studying things like the United Nations, you're doing units of inquiry and these kind of things. The more you understand about the world, the more you understand what's going on, the more it really makes you want to get involved. If you live your whole life kind of in a very small frame, then that's how you choose to live your life. You know, you can have a family, you can go to school, there's nothing wrong with that. But the more you see things that are going on in the world, it does push you to want to be part of it, and that's what happened to me. So when I was growing up, I studied history. And British history has a lot of complicated and very impactful moments and times. I mean, we had an empire. A lot of the world is shaped by British policy for the last few centuries. We were a world power. So when you look at some of the situations that are going on in the world today and you learn about history, you learn about the fact that there is injustice in the world. So it's not just about an earthquake happened yesterday or a war broke out tomorrow. It's about looking at a pattern and global events. And if you become a global citizen and understand that there is things that need to be changed in the world, it drives you a little bit. And so I started thinking more and more, and yeah, that's why I eventually got into this work.
Was there a particular moment, experience, or incident that inspired you to pursue this path?
So a similar way, not really, but there was a growing consciousness. So I went on from school to then study history at university. I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I knew I wanted to learn more about the world because that inquiry had started. Why were people living in poverty in Africa? Why did they seem to have governments that didn't work while my country was so rich? Why was America all powerful and making decisions? So it led again to an awakening and an ongoing exploration as to why the world is like it is, why crises happen, why social injustice and poverty happens. And that led me to study human rights at university, because I'm working in humanitarian, but my first degree was in human rights. My first degree was in history. And again, that's when you understand that people have rights. Everyone has rights, no matter where they live in the world. And the fact that people are deprived of those rights, that live in such different circumstances to perhaps you and I, is a form of injustice. Again, these gradual awakenings, this inquiry leads you to then start working. And I have examples from my work, but this was what led me to try to get into it.
You have worked across multiple regions of the world. What types of emergencies and crises have you primarily been involved in responding to?
Okay. Well, so let's talk about some big ones. So I've been working in this sector for 20 years now, quite long, and primarily natural disasters have included earthquakes. There was the Haiti earthquake in 2010, that was huge. I was there in the first few weeks of that emergency, and I stayed for most of that year in Haiti. I've been in floods in Pakistan, where people have lost everything, and they've been displaced into other parts. I've been in 3 cholera emergencies. Cholera is not a very nice disease. But again, the thing with a disease or a virus like cholera is it affects the most poor, the most vulnerable, and it's entirely treatable. So when you have cholera emergency and a humanitarian response, it's usually because it's a broken country, it's affecting the most poor, and they need aid and health care to get out of it. And then war. So there's the natural disasters and then there's war. Both have similarities in terms of causing the same humanitarian crisis, but of course people affected and displaced by conflict has a much more pressing protection needs. It's very serious, people get killed, and the conflicts very rarely have short-term outcomes. They can go on for years. The Syria war went on for 10 years. I was working on it for 3.5. And I've also worked in the Middle East for a long time. I've worked in Africa. And right now I'm working on Myanmar. So even though I get to live in India, I'm traveling to Myanmar on Saturday, actually. I get to visit my teams, but I can't live there because the war is ongoing, and my organization does not have registration with the military authorities because they're fighting a war. But my teams are on the ground and they're delivering amazing basic humanitarian assistance to people displaced by the war. So yeah, it's conflict and it's natural disasters. They're the two.
What kind of support and assistance does your humanitarian programs typically provide to affected communities?
Great. Yeah. So again, this is the kind of question that it's good to try and unpack it and explain. Otherwise, it's very hard to understand. Like, what is humanitarian aid? What are you actually doing for people? So again, if it's emergency basic services, you just have to think, if I was affected by conflict, if I had to leave my house tomorrow and go sit in a refugee camp, what would I need? So the basic services are healthcare. The organization I work for now doesn't do health, but I have worked for organizations that run health clinics, like basic health clinics. If you're hurt, if you need treatment, if you have a disease that needs treated, you need to provide those basic healthcare services. There's also food. First thing you need when you get displaced, where you're going to get your next meal from. So there's a lot of food needs and cash needs that people need when they're displaced. Safe shelter. This could be anything from a tent I've been to massive refugee camps where people living in tents, and they don't just live in tents for a week, they live in tents for months, for years, depending on the war. Or it could be that they've moved to a local neighborhood and they need to live with a family, or they need to rent a house, anything that makes someone safe. There's also protection needs, and when we talk about protection, we talk about what either decreases your safety or increases your safety. So a war, of course, conflict, it's a very dangerous situation, but even natural disasters. Anywhere that you have taken out of your own home, you're put somewhere else, there's no services, there's perhaps armed groups, criminal groups, there's no safety, perhaps you've lost your passport, your citizen ID, you can't prove who you are, the people can take advantage of you. You have to look at all the needs of someone that's living in displacement, so also protection and legal services and rights. So these are the things we provide. And you do this by going into a community and doing an assessment. So let's take the Myanmar conflict that I'm working on right now. If a conflict breaks out in a part of Myanmar that's new and my team hears about this and 100, let's say 1,000 people are displaced into a neighboring town, my team will go and talk to them. They'll do an assessment and they'll say, what do you need? And based on that, all those services I mentioned we'll arrange. We'll either arrange shelter, food, cash. We'll talk to them about their legal rights. If we can't do that, we refer them to another agency. There's a huge coordination aspect to humanitarian work. It's not just me. It's not just my organization. There are local organizations doing it. I'm sure there's organizations right here in Palavakkam that provide services to the poor and all that. Same anywhere. Local organizations, national organizations, international, the UN, everyone is providing the same services. So we just have to coordinate. So that's what it looks like. It's the basic services coordinated.
What does a typical work day look like for you? Do you mainly work in offices, on the field, or a combination of both?
Now, if you asked me this 10 years ago, my answer would be, no, probably 15 years ago, my answer would be far more interesting. So yes, when I first started, I was much more in the field. So I did emergency missions. So I mentioned Haiti, I mentioned Uganda, I mentioned Sierra Leone. These are ones that I would go out with a team in a first phase emergency response, and I'd be responsible with teams, with my local staff, to go to the affected communities, talk to them, assess their needs, start providing services, setting up a health clinic. I've spent nights head down in buckets in warehouses, counting mops and buckets, making sure that we had all the right kit for distributions. I've gone to banks and got massive amounts of money out so we can do cash distributions. I've worked with community volunteers to run health campaigns in displaced people's camps. You know, anything on the ground. That's what field work looks like. But really, field work is done by local people. It's not done by people like me, and it shouldn't be. The majority of work should be done by people in the community, people on the ground, but you do need that international expertise to come in the first phase to set it all up, have the money, train people. So I used to do that. Now, much later, I'm a bit older, and I've gained a bit more skills, and I now understand how to manage these operations, how to direct teams, how to put an aid operation together. So that's my job now. I'm a head of program. I sit behind a desk most of the time. I take calls. I sit in India because I can't be based in Myanmar. And I talk to my teams. I take meetings. I brief donors. I brief the UN. I brief stakeholders on the situation. I try to raise money. I set direction. I set plans. I monitor programs. I visit the programs, but I don't deliver them. That's my national teams that do that. So now my workday, and rightly so, is quite office-based. Not as fun, right? But before I used to be in the field, but that's when I was younger. But you have to remember, there's a lot of people doing the work. My role is now to help and support and direct the work. So that's if you saw me today working, I'm in front of my computer.
Are some of the biggest challenges you face in humanitarian work, especially conflict or disaster-affected regions?
Yeah, I mean, the challenges are huge. I mean, should I just pick one? No, let's pick a few. So the first up is funding. There's decreasing funding across the world. There is little money for humanitarian response, and it's getting more and more weaker. I mean, it looks like there's a lot, but there's not. The US last year cancelled their humanitarian aid program under Trump. We all had to stop work. You heard stories in the media about, clinics being shut down and vital programs being stopped because of political reasons. People decided that humanitarian aid was not worth funding. Now that's being slightly reversed now. We're seeing like a bigger commitment by donors and by the world to understand where they put their money. And there is a discussion to be had how to fund humanitarian aid work, but the money is going down. So the big challenge in humanitarian aid work is not just expect lots of money to be poured into countries, but how to use that money efficiently and to make sure that when people are affected by crisis, you can help them and not just expect money. The other big challenge with disaster and conflict affected is access. We talk about access all the time, and that's a very humanitarian term. It means, can we actually get to the people? And can they get to the services? Can they access the services, and can we access them? Sounds very simple, but in a conflict zone, sometimes you can't. If the military junta in Myanmar doesn't want me and my organization registered, I can't go in. So limited access to the people in need is a huge problem. And then having the money to actually serve them is another. There are loads more, but those, if we talk about access and funding, there's a big on humanitarian agenda.
What is a common misconception people have about humanitarian aid or even humanitarian workers?
Great. Always had a lot of these. I'm not sure if it's still true, but when I was younger, it was very true in the UK. So the first one is that humanitarian workers are volunteers, that it's just we're charity workers, right? That you shouldn't be paid for doing this kind of work because you're helping people. You should just want to help people. The reality is it's a sector, it's an industry. You get trained to do it. I have a family I need to support. So there is a professional humanitarian aid worker, but you should only get paid if you are professional. If you can't do the job and you're not doing the job properly, you should not have a job in the humanitarian aid sector, because the other misconception is the foreigner flying into a country and being that savior, So I've had two things. I've had people say to me, you shouldn't get a salary, you should be doing this for charity. And I'm like, well, I need to pay my bills. And the second reaction I've had when I tell people I'm an aid worker is, aren't you great? You're wonderful, doing all that wonderful work. And I say, whoa, hang on a second. No, I'm not great. I have a job to do. But really, the work is done by the people on the ground. The majority of aid workers are local people, not me. And that's the way it should be. You should not be paying me and sending me into Myanmar to do something that my colleague can do on the ground. So there's two misconceptions. One, that the industry doesn't exist. Yes, we get paid. But the second, the frontline emergency aid workers are local people, local organizations. The first people to help you when you're in a crisis is probably a member of your family, probably your neighbor, probably someone who's at your church. That's who helps you, not me flying in. But there is a need for a coordinated aid response. So when we think of emergency aid workers, try to think of the people already affected. They are the aid workers.
Which skills do you think are most essential in your profession?
Yes, now I have to think about my skills and experience. So there's many things you can do in the humanitarian aid sector. Me personally, I'm what's called a generalist. In humanitarian aid response, you can get nurses, you can get engineers, you can get teachers, you can get people who have trained to be a job and then apply their skills in humanitarian response. So I've worked with amazing teachers, amazing engineers, building shelters, teachers setting up schools, nurses working in health clinics. They're amazing. I'm none of those things. So what am I? I'm a generalist, which means that over the years, I've developed the skills and experience on how to engage with communities, how to assess needs, how to manage and direct, like project manage huge international responses, how to fundraise. So now I'm a head of program for my organization. It's been 20 years of learning how it all works. How it all works and understanding my role in it, understanding my privilege, where I should be, how to work with local communities, how to listen to communities, how to design an aid response. It takes experience and it takes skills. It's not something you learn in university. So if there's a question coming up, how do I get a degree to be an aid worker? I don't know. There are lots of degrees like international development or human rights, but they just equip you with a starting knowledge. Really, humanitarian aid work is learned by doing. It's learnt by being humble, getting out there. At the beginning, you're often a volunteer. You can volunteer, you have to listen to people, you have to go in, you have to learn what you're doing, and then you have value. Then you're valued enough to be paid, and then you can actually make a difference. So my skills and experience are basically like, I now manage big operations. I'm a project manager, but also I like to think that I understand enough about what's going on that I can make the decisions that matter.
Could you share a particularly meaningful or heartwarming moment from your work that has stayed with you?
Yes. It's good to think of those moments and not about, yes, all the difficult things. So I can't pick one, but when I think about what's been really positive in my experiences, maybe heartwarming, but positive, you know, it's about the people I work with when I'm in the field. So when I go to Myanmar, or in my past experiences when I've been working with affected communities and disasters, it always comes from the people you work with. They're either working with me or they're in the community. So this engagement with people, there's always stories they tell you, you know, very sad stories sometimes, but also very resilient stories. So there's a lot, but now you've asked me this, I'm just thinking about one time. And I had a driver in Haiti, and he was called Jean-Paul. And everyone in Port-au-Prince in Haiti was affected by this massive earthquake, everyone. And so we recruited local staff from Port-au-Prince, the capital city of Haiti. And you had to be aware that the people you are now working with, whether they be drivers or like nurses or anyone that you've got your team around you to deliver the aid response, they're also affected by the earthquake. But you were so busy, sometimes you forgot. I had Jean-Paul being my driver, and he was driving me around, and we were going to camps and talking to people and organizing warehousing and doing all this. I was talking to Jean-Paul one time, and he reminded me, because we were talking about his family, that he'd actually lost a brother in the earthquake. And it was a real shock for me, because I remember thinking, of course, everyone I'm working with has been affected and has lost somebody. But still, he was so positive. He said, look, now I'm doing something. Like, he's grieving, obviously. But he was so committed. I mean, he had a job, which was good for his family. But he was staying in a shack. He built his own shack. He had a birthday while I was there. I went to his birthday party. We drank rum and played guitar all night. It was great. But he was part of the affected community. He'd personally suffered from the earthquake, but he was as positive as he could be. He worked side by side with me every day. He taught me more French than I had before. So these little instances of just being in the community and working with them, there's always that heartwarming, there's always that positivity, and you feel very grateful for the people you work with.
After witnessing so much global suffering, how do you maintain emotional resilience and avoid burnout?
Yes, this is a question that can be asked a lot, especially if you're working in the field. So now I'm a bit step back. It is a bit different. When I was working in the field, it is hard. You do see a lot, but you do remind yourself all the time, you are not in the same situation that these people are. You know, you go to home, sometimes I'd have a hotel room, sometimes I'd be sleeping in a tent, but I can go home at the end of the day. So it's very hard to witness other people suffering, but knowing that you're doing something about it and that you're there for a reason is a positive thing. If you go to pieces and you start being upset all the time, go home. You know, you have to be there for a reason. So you have to be strong, and the people's responses, and like the story about Jean-Paul, like being so positive, really wakes you up and just go, no, you have to get on with it. It doesn't mean that you're not affected by it. And I tell you what affects me more than, I guess, what you phrase as global suffering. The more you're in this sector and the more you're in this industry, you realize, again, the awakening and the understanding how the world works, it's more about injustice. And that's what can be really upsetting as an aid worker, because especially as a humanitarian aid worker, you very rarely change anything. You don't. I mean, we do advocacy and we advocate for rights, but very rarely. The people that change things are the people in power. So it's politicians. It's the leader of the army that's waging the war. It's communities that decide to do something. Anybody that has some power changes something. So when you get called into another crisis where there's people suffering needlessly because some politician has waged a war on a country that he doesn't understand, he doesn't care about, it's the people that are suffering. So the suffering is caused by injustice. So it's really the injustice that can really affect anybody in this sector, this humanitarian sector, to say, you know, what's the point? Why did I go into Yemen and deliver aid when the British government just sold arms and started bombing again? So that kind of thing is very hard to kind of manage, but you have to be aware of that. And you can't be naive. And working for change and delivering humanitarian aid and being positive on the humanitarian principles does help. But it's hard. And again, seeing the positivity of the people you work with is a wonderful thing.
Does the school's emphasis on values, international mindedness, and global awareness stand out to you?
Yes, I'm very pleased to say yes. My son had very little, do you know him?
Thomas.
Yes,
Yes.
Thomas. No, he didn't, not that he didn't have interest in what I did, but he was a bit younger, so he didn't really understand what I did. But since he's been involved in some of the programs here and the Model UN, he's had a lot more questions for me. It's been wonderful because his inquiry has started. The awareness has started. And so he talks to me, says, Mum, what's happening with the military authorities in Myanmar? Why are they fighting this group? And I explain it to him, and he's like, right, and then he can have a conversation with me. And it's wonderful seeing that awareness and that awakening. I'm not saying Tom is going to become a humanitarian aid worker. You don't all have to join my sector. But having children in schools being exposed to this questioning and being aware of what's going on will ultimately make you a much more broader individual. It will make you understand the decisions you make, the world around you, why things are the way you are. So if someone tells you, oh, well, those people deserved it, you can say, no, that's not right. The world is a certain way because I understand how it works, and this is what should change. So I've seen that with Tom, and I've seen the questions he's asked me, so I'm very pleased that Alphabet School is doing a lot more on these kind of lines of inquiry.
The IB learner profile highlights the value of being caring, which closely aligns with your profession. Do you see this reflected in your child's learning experience?
Yes, I think so. Tom and Penny, my two children, seem very empathetic, and the topics we discuss from school does show that. They have a lot of questions about the environment, questions about my work. The way they talk with their friends, I think, shows a very empathetic culture that's here. Caring is a nice way of putting it, but again, I think you care because you understand. You care because you understand your fellow classmate as a human being. You care because you understand that people shouldn't be treated differently because of certain things. So that kind of value that's being instilled in the children here, yes, it's very important.
After long and demanding days, what helped you relax and recharge? A cup of coffee, a long walk, music, movies, or something else?
Yes, I mean, great question. And we actually ask aid workers that question when we recruit them, because you have to have a life outside of work, right? Because people get into this sector because it's a passion, it's a cause, it's not a job that you go and do and then leave. It stays with you and you want to do it. So we ask them the same thing. What do you do outside of work? You have to have that balance. And for me personally, I have my family. I get to live in Chennai. I travel for my work. So, for example, I'm going to Myanmar on Saturday for 2 weeks, but when I come back, I'm back with my family. So I get to hang out with my kids. We get to do stuff together. And also a big part of my life is music. So I play the saxophone and my husband plays guitar, and we play in jazz bands here in Chennai. We just did a jazz festival last weekend, which was a lot of fun. So we spend a lot of time playing music and hanging out with the kids. And it's very needed in order to make a little bit of separation and to recharge, because then you have to get back to work the next day. Yeah.
How has working so closely with vulnerable communities changed your perspective on privilege, gratitude, and everyday life?
Perfect question. And that's what I think everybody should ask themselves. Vulnerable communities, or any communities or affected communities, sitting at home in the UK, I would not have come across the kind of people I've met through my work. I wouldn't. I mean, there are people that are, underprivileged in the UK, but I led my own little life, and all I knew was the people that were on the same level as me, same ethnic background, same economic opportunities. As soon as you get put somewhere else, you realize you know very little about the world. You really do. And it's a bit of a shock. And then you have to humble yourself, and you have to start talking to people that you're working with and get to know them and understand what's going on. And it really affects the way you see yourself. I look back at my life in the UK, and yes, you see your privilege, that you can go home, that my parents helped me through school, that I had a good education, I have a good job. I have a network that supports me. Should anything go wrong, I have privilege in terms of my passport, in terms of my society, in terms of my family. So it makes you very grateful for who you are and what you are. And if you recognize that, you don't have to feel guilty, but understand it, and then understand the power of the communities, because they are not the victims either. Just because I go to a community that is less economically wealthy as the UK, they have a lot more in other ways than I do. They have agency. So you also understand, as you understand nothing, and then you start to grow your experience, that people live lives in very different ways, and they have to use their own agencies and power, and you're not there to feel privileged above them. You're there to support and be of use, and if there's a change to be made, to try and support a change, such as a disaster. But otherwise, never assume that you know another community's power or deprivation. It's very enlightening, and yes, I am very aware of my own privilege as a result. Thank you.
If there is one message or lesson you hope our listeners take away from your journey in humanitarian work, what would it be?
Just one. Just one. Okay. One message or lesson. And I think you're way ahead of it here because you seem very aware. To really think, to increase your awareness and your inquiry about what's going on in the world. So my one struggle with humanitarian work sometimes with people from the outside is they see it as an act of charity. Again, it's just like, oh, poor people, they should get something. But that's a danger of then people deciding who gets something. So really coming back to this humanitarian principles, I would want people to understand that everybody is deserving of humanitarian aid. And often humanitarian aid is politicized because of politics, wars. There are massive injustices going on in the world. And people are living in poverty and struggling not because they don't have money, but because the systems are put in place to stop them from either progressing or getting the services they need. There's a massive global injustice that leads to humanitarian suffering. And so whenever you see something on the news and you see a war or an earthquake, just for people to understand that it's not, oh, poor people, it's these poor people are going to be impacted because of the way the world works. So having a bit more of an understanding of how it works and not just thinking of it as a charity or something that couldn't happen to you. It could happen to you as well. But if you have privilege, you're less likely to suffer. You know, if I'm in a flood, when were the floods? 2 years ago, right? In Chennai. My condo got flooded out. We had to leave. We lost power for a couple of days. We packed up the cat and Tom and Penny, and we went through the floodwaters to my mother-in-law's house. We were fine. We lost power for 2 days. Other people were not fine because when they got flooded out, they didn't have somewhere to go. They had everything ruined. They didn't have the money to buy things back. So understanding that humanitarian aid work is also about injustice. It's not just about a conflict or a war, and then that allows people to be a lot more informed about why it is the way it is. Yeah.
And finally, what advice would you give a student who wants to pursue careers in humanitarian aid, international relations, or global development?
So these are all areas, these are all degrees and studies you can do. But really, what do you want to do? What do you actually want to achieve? I think that's a good thing. And you won't know. I didn't know. When I was 17 and I was thinking, what am I going to do for university? I went and did a history degree, but I knew I wanted to do something in human rights. So I got there eventually. So if you're looking at the sector and you're saying you want to be a part of something, don't worry if you don't know right now, because there's so many things you can do. So there's no point sitting there and saying, I want to be a head of programs for an INGO. You might not be a head of programs for an INGO. You might end up being a legal specialist for a UN agency. You might end up going into advocacy. You might end up going into development with a bank. You might end up being in politics. All these things contribute to these things that you mentioned: international development, global development, poverty and justice, all this kind of thing. So do your studies, but expose yourself to the sector. Try to do some volunteering. Usually straight after university, there are kind of internships that you can do. Do them. Do them as when you're young and maybe mum and dad can help you out, or you still can do it. Because until you start experiencing the sector, that's what gives you the career. Because I've been asked, how do I get your job? And I said, I don't know how I got my job. You just have to start doing it. It's not as straightforward as learning to be an engineer or learning to be a banker. There's no straight path, but it's a good start doing these degrees, and then you have to expose yourself. On the flip side, you don't necessarily have to do these degrees either. If you wanted to be a nurse or a doctor, go train and be a nurse or a doctor. Go work in a hospital here. It's to help people here. And then you could the next day go, I actually want to work in the aid sector, and you'll go be a doctor in Syria. You'll go be a doctor in Sudan. These are transferable skills. You don't have to just study the aid sector to be in the aid sector. There are many different paths and many different skills. So yeah, it's all about just finding your own way.
Thank you so much for joining us, ma'am. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Voices of AIS, and we will be back soon with more episodes.